Okay, hello YouTube. Today we're going to be taking a look at the King's Gambit, beginning after e4, e5, f4. This begins the King's Gambit, and more specifically today we're going to be taking a look at this counter gambit known as the Faulkbeer Counter Gambit, beginning with this move pawn to d5. So anyways, if you like content like this and you want to see more of it, please hit that subscribe button and click on your notification icon. So this move, pawn to d5, it's super popular at the club level. Like at the sub 2000 level, people love to play this because apparently it's very, very trappy. Now, full disclosure, I've never fallen for any of these traps. I've found all of the traps to be very, very obvious. Apparently, one trap that people fall for occasionally is white can play f takes e4 here, walking face first into queen h4 check, g3, queen takes e4 check, picking up the rook on h1 because it's a fork. It's forking the king and it's forking the rook. This is never a trap that I've fallen for because queen h4 to me is incredibly obvious, so the move f takes e5 never actually occurs to me to play. So I've always just played the only move that I see in the position, which is just e takes d5, which is the move everybody should play here. So when you see d5, you should just immediately play e takes d5. So now, the Faulkbeer Counter Gambit can be a way that people can play the King's Gambit accepted modern variation by simply transposing to it with this move e takes f4. And this should just be a direct transposition. After e takes f4, knight f3, we simply transposed back into the modern accepted variation, which you could have just as easily reached by, say, accepting the gambit with e takes f4, and after white chooses to play the king's knight's gambit, you play the move pawn to d5, and then after e takes d5, we have this direct transposition. Now, that being said, the Faulkbeer Counter Gambit could be a move order trick that you might want to use to get into the modern accepted line if you know that your opponent plays, say, the king's bishop's gambit. After, say, e takes f4, you know that this move bishop c4 is his main line in the King's Gambit, and you decided that you wanted to avoid that, and you happen to play the accepted modern variation. So this could be a move order trick for that. So d5, e takes d5, e takes f4 for black is a move here, and in my opinion, it's probably the best move here, because the other two moves that get played here are just going in the spirit of counter gambiting. So the other two moves that get played here are pawn to e4 and pawn to c6. So these are the two main moves, is pawn to e4 with the idea of restricting this knight from developing to f3. This is by far and away the most popular move that I see at the club level and at the sub 2000 level. It's apparently the move that's the trappiest, although I don't understand. Again, full disclosure, I don't understand what all the traps are, because if you play solid moves, like, you don't even really give black the opportunity to make the threats that everybody is afraid of falling for. So we'll get to that in a minute. But e4 is the most popular club level move, and of course the other move that's possible here is this move pawn to c6, which is actually a much more sophisticated way to try to play the gambit. Because a really interesting fact about pawn to c6 is it's an attempt to, again, transpose into the mainline modern variation, but in a way that's actually favorable for black if you were to accept this pawn immediately. So the point is that if you accept this pawn immediately with something like, say, dc6, knight c6 should actually just be advantage black. And it's for a very interesting reason. The reason is, again, you can't play f takes e4, f takes e5, because we have this threat, queen h4 followed by queen e4 check, picking up that rook on h1. So since you can't play f takes e5, that means that e takes f4 is the main threat in the position. And against most normal moves, this is going to transpose into the King's Gambit accepted modern line, but with one very specific, very important difference. So after e takes f4, for example, let's just say like knight f3, e takes f4, d4, bishop d6, right? This should just be slight edge black. And the reason that it's slight edge black is because it's identical to this line that you can reach in the modern variation that would go e takes f4, pawn to d5, and this is why it's important, knight f3, pawn to d5, and this is why it's important to know multiple openings. E takes d5, and now we would have this main line, which is knight f6, bishop b5 is a theoretical move here, and it's actually one of the theoretical moves I recommend in this position. Pawn to c6 takes knight c6, and you can see how closely this transposes. Knight to c3, bishop d6. We could have a direct transposition in this other line, but the main difference is this knight is on f6. And believe it or not, that's a big deal. Like, if we go back to this other line, and we do this other move order with the Faulkbeer Counter Gambit move order with, say, d5, e takes d5, and then say pawn to c6, and we take right away, we play d takes c6, knight c6, if we go into this line with knight to f3, e takes f4, and then d4, bishop d6, if I continue with bishop b5, this knight has the possibility to develop to the e7 square. And in every conceivable way that we can transpose into the line, like if we try knight c3, e takes f4, knight f3, and then say bishop d6, this knight is developing to e7 instead of f6 on bishop b5. So these positions are all just slight edge black. So the only other question that you can really ask is, can I take the pawn and then just try to keep it? And the answer to that is absolutely disastrous. If you play pawn to d3 here and try to keep the pawn, basically saying, hey, if you play e takes f4, I'm going to play bishop f4 and I'm up a pawn. This is the exact opposite of a gambit. Black has gambited the pawn now. And now black actually is the one that has compensation. And not only does black have compensation, he has more than enough compensation for a pawn. This position actually shouldn't just be advantage black. It should be somewhere between major to decisive advantage black. Black has more space. Black has more development, and white's development is hampered. He has a difficult time developing this bishop because this pawn is in the way. In fact, this pawn on d3 is in the way of white finishing his development in any normal, natural way. And that's actually all black has to do here. Black has to just finish his development in a normal, natural way, and he will have an advantage because he has more space. And that advantage is not a small one. It's actually a major advantage. His space and his development is worth much more than a pawn. So he could just continue with knight f6. Notice all the open lines that I've highlighted for development, the lack of space, the lack of the ability to develop in a natural way. White's never going to get off the ground. This is just going to be like a romantic era Morphy game, is the way that it should end if black plays correctly. So we're going to have knight to c3, just bishop c5, just develop. And now there's two moves here that I've kind of taken a look at. Queen d2 is the fantasy line that I worked out on my computer, having Stockfish kind of play against itself. And here black would just castle, knight on g to e2, b5, castles queenside, b4, knight to e4, takes. We don't want to exchange queens, queen b6, king b1, bishop e6, just developing. Knight c1 to try to hold the queenside, a5. And black is just going to have a decisive queenside attack. Stockfish just gives this his decisive advantage, black. So we don't want to fall into this if we're playing the white pieces. And the other thing that we don't want to fall into is just the other line that got played here. And I am following this game, Koziak versus Lubensky, that continued queen e2 check, bishop e6. And this was equally just decisive advantage black. And it had a cute finish, so I'll show the rest of it. Knight f3 castles, knight e4 takes. Queen to b6, Morphy-esque, we have to play c3 to defend, and then we had rook e8, b3, bringing the other rook to the open files, notice the lack of development, and then simply rook d1, bishop f2 check, winning, because queen f2, rook d1 either wins the queen on f2, or after king e2, rook d1, we just say, hey, look, we're up a rook, and white went ahead and resigned. So the short answer is, you don't want to take on c6. Just don't take on c6. It's bad. So if you don't want to take on c6, that makes things pretty obvious. So if you just know enough after they play c6, I don't want to take. If I take on c6, that's advantage black. So I have to avoid that. So you know enough to play just a developing move, to play knight to c3. And this will also transpose into the King's Gambit accepted modern variation. But here, the transposition, as long as you never take on c6, the transposition is favorable for white, because the pawn on f4 will eventually fall. So the point is after e takes f4, you're just going to play knight f3, bishop d6, because that's critical. We have to hold that shield pawn. And then, again, we don't take on c6. If we take on c6, it's advantage black. After takes, bishop to b5, the knight can simply go to g7, and we're never getting that pawn on f4. We're never getting our pawn back. We're never getting an advantage. This is just advantage black all day long. So we have to avoid that scenario. We have to avoid the scenario where the knight goes to e7. So we keep the pawn on d5. We simply play d4, threatening to play bishop takes f4. So now, they have to finish their development and they have to castle. So knight f6, very logical move, queen e2. And we're actually following the game Nepomniachtchi versus Alexenko, played in Moscow back in 2021. And that game continued king f8, and then this move knight to e5. So the idea is we never do anything about that pawn on d5, because we don't care if they capture it, because our whole goal was to play queen e2 followed by knight e5, so we could capture the much more important pawn on f4, which is what Nepomniachtchi does on his next move. He plays bishop takes f4. And once you play bishop takes f4 here, this position is now advantage white. Not just advantage white, probably major advantage white. White is doing really good once he eliminates that shield pawn. Anytime you have the King's Gambit accepted modern variation, if you want to have anything with black, you have to hold that shield pawn on f4. And if white manages to capture the shield pawn on f4, it's usually pretty clearly advantage white, because now the material is even, and when white finishes development, castles, etc., he's going to have a huge attack down the f-file, and this is even a little bit worse than that, because the king has already been forced to move, and is actually sitting on f8, and is going to have to spend a couple more moves to get off of that square. So, anyways, this is just advantage white. White's doing very good here. So that game continued knight c6, castles queenside, but we don't have to go into the rest of the game or the rest of what happened. So anyways, going back, that's how we're going to meet pawn to c6. So how do we meet this other move? How do we meet this club favorite move instead of pawn to c6? How do we meet the club favorite pawn to e4? Because this is probably the most common move that we're going to run into. So apparently at the club level, there's a lot of traps here that I've never even gotten close to falling for. Because whenever a strong player sees a pawn like this on the e4 square, he immediately thinks this is a thorn pawn. A thorn pawn is a pawn, it's a thorn in your side. You don't want it there. And it's preventing the normal development of your pieces with knight to f3. So when strong players see a thorn pawn, they don't think, oh, there's a pawn on my side of the board. Eventually I'll be able to gang up on it and capture it. No, they think, I need to exchange for that pawn as quickly as possible to get rid of it. I'm not going to even attempt to win it because I just need to get rid of that pawn. So, among strong players, you'll never see this move, knight to c3, which maybe happens at the club level. I don't know any of the traps that happen after knight c3, because, again, knight c3 has never been on my radar as even a possibility, because I basically just play d3 as a knee-jerk reaction to seeing a pawn on the e4 square. I play d3 because I want to get rid of this pawn. I want to get rid of it as quickly as possible. I don't want there to be problems with my development. I want to be able to develop that knight to f3. I want to be able to develop all my pieces naturally. d3 is the only way for me to do that. So d3 is the absolute best move in this position. And from here, white's moves are actually really natural to get an advantage. Because black doesn't really have a whole lot of options on how he can continue. He can continue with queen takes d5, and he can continue with knight f6, and at least to me, it's always been fairly obvious how to proceed in both cases. Against queen takes d5, we should just play knight to c3 and attack the queen. And after bishop to b4, we should just play bishop d2, and if they take the knight, we take back. If they develop, we solve our problem at the earliest convenience. We play d takes e4, and actually developing with the knight to f6 and developing with the knight to e7 are both very similar. We should just take on e4, and after queen takes e4, we should play queen e2. There is this game, Jonkman versus Jansen, which continued queen takes f4, bishop g7, and this should just be some sort of advantage white. White has the two bishops. White got his pawn back with bishop takes g7, and actually white did go on to win in that game. That was Jonkman versus Jansen, played back in 2000, but needless to say, this should be advantage white. And the other way that this can be played is knight f6, and this is kind of an interesting lesson in just the power of having a huge positional advantage. We should still take on e4, and then after queen takes, we should play queen e2, and after bishop g4, we should play knight f3. And believe it or not, this is just major advantage white. Probably even just after a few more moves, it's probably just decisive advantage white. So like if bishop takes f3 to double our pawns, g takes f3, queen e2, bishop e2, not only is this major advantage white, it's probably already decisive advantage white. The bishop pair and the open board should give white a decisive advantage. And I know just looking at this optically, it's very difficult to understand this. But on an open board, the bishop pair is extremely powerful. And when you combine that with two open files for the rooks, like the open files of the G file, the E file, and the D file, it becomes nearly impossible to defend. So, just to demonstrate this, to show you this complete game, this was actually Fedorovsky versus Bardas, played in Buenos Aires back in 1965. Continued knight on b to d7, castles queenside, bishop c4. And now the slicing and dicing bishops are working together. The bishop on c4 is attacking the f7 square. That needs to be defended. So again, it still doesn't look that bad, right? But bishop b4. The power of slicing and dicing bishops. This provokes yet another weakness. We have to play c5 just to hold the pawn on f7. Bishop to a5, hitting that rook on d8, provoking another weakness. b6, bishop comes back to c3. So now after king c7, the other rook comes to e1. We're just threatening to infiltrate with rook e7. It's a very difficult move to meet. So we have knight to e8, and then we have rook e7, which pins that knight. King c6, a4, resigns. And of course, the reason that black resigns is he's hanging the pawn on f7. There's also simply a threat of bishop to b5 check, winning the knight on d7. And there's just too many threats with the two bishops and the two rooks just working extremely beautifully together. There's really no way to stop this. And if you go back and look at the game and run an engine on it and look at alternatives for black, there's really no way to prevent white from infiltrating with his rooks and with his bishops and winning massive amounts of material at some point. There's just no way to avoid it. So that's kind of how we meet queen d5. We just play the immediate knight c3 and we go from there. The other move is knight to f6. And in this case, we just take on e4 immediately. When we take on e4 immediately, we've eliminated our developing problem. Now we can develop our knight to f3 freely. So after, say, knight takes e4, we just simply finish our development with knight to f3. And now the normal move that people try here is bishop to c5, creating a threat on f2. So now, again, the move here should be obvious. And to me, it's obvious. All my moves up to this point have been obvious, and my next move is incredibly obvious, at least to me. Because the threat is something going to f2, I have to counter that threat. I don't have a choice. And the only logical move to counter that threat is the move queen e2. It's the only move that works in the position. It pins the knight to the king and prevents black from doing something mean to me with the knight moving to f2, because now the knight can't move. So it's the only move that you can play. So now the game that we're following here is actually Bronstein versus Weissman, played in 1976. There were some earlier games in this line, but the Bronstein versus Weissman game is the game where white played the most accurately. After bishop to f5, white continued in this game with knight to c3. In a previous game, somebody tried g4, which wasn't as good. But knight to c3 is just advantage white all day long. Knight to c3, putting more pressure on that knight on the e4 square. Again, very natural move to develop a piece and attack a piece that's pinned. And then after queen to e7, again, a very natural move here for white, and for me, a move that's very obvious, because when I played queen e2, one of the ideas behind that was not only mechanically preventing the knight from queen to f2, but also threatening to stop all the threats with the move bishop to e3. And that's, of course, white's next move, just bishop to e3. And then after bishop e3, queen e3, we have knight c3. We exchange the queens. We take on the c3 square. Black gets his pawn back with bishop to c2, but black by no means equalizes by playing bishop to c2. Because white has better control of the center, and white has more development and lots of extra tempos, beginning with the move king to d2. And so white should have an advantage here. And that's exactly what happened in this Bronstein versus Weissman game. Bronstein continued with king to d2, bishop a4. This is a very uncomfortable square for this bishop. It's going to get attacked again for tempo. We have rook to e1 check, king to d6, and then after knight g5, black is in all kinds of trouble. We're threatening knight takes f7 check. The king is still in a firing range. We still have plenty of pieces to attack that king. Black is in a lot of trouble here. King to d4, rook e4, gaining that tempo against the bishop and taking advantage of the fact that we can now attack the king that is in the middle of the board. And we're doing that all at the same time. So bishop e8 gets played to defend that pawn on f7 from the knight. And now we have rook d4 check, king c6, bishop e2, threatening bishop f3 check. Very powerful check, which apparently cannot be countered. We're going to play bishop f3 check almost no matter what black does. So we have knight d7 just trying to develop, bishop f3, king b8, rook b1, and now black is in a mating net, and simultaneously after king a5, he's not just in a mating net, he's in a situation where after rook b7, he might just be losing all of his material on the 7th rank. So he has to avoid mate, but also avoid losing all of his stuff, and one of those two things is just going to happen. So the game finished pretty easily. Finished h6, rook takes c7, threatening the rook on a8, so there's no time for h6, g5, so we have rook b8, then we have knight takes f7, bishop to f7, rook takes d7, and black just gave up. All of his stuff on the 7th rank is hanging, and he's also still in a whole bunch of different mating nets with his king sitting on that very vulnerable a5 square. So there's really no reason to play on. He's already down 2 pawns, and he's going to lose at least a couple more. So he's going to lose the pawn on a7, probably the pawn on g7 as well, and maybe some other stuff. So that was Bronstein versus Weissman, played back in 1976. So in summary, this is how you need to play against the counter gambit. When they play the Faulkbeer Counter Gambit, beginning with pawn to d5, you should take on the d5 square. And if they play the move pawn to c6, the main thing that you have to remember is just do not take on c6 immediately. Just play the move knight to c3 and leave that pawn on the d5 square. Go into the modern variation in a way that favors white. So go after this check, play knight e5, and then take that pawn on f4. And then the only other thing you really have to remember is after e takes d5, if they play pawn to e4, contest that pawn immediately with the move pawn to d3. And then after that, at least for me, all the moves are pretty natural. When you have an opportunity to take that pawn, you take that pawn. If they take on d5 with the queen, you attack the queen, you get the bishop pair. And then at the earliest opportunity, you take the pawn on e4. And everything else should just be pretty natural. So anyways, I hope you found this video helpful. I hope you learned something new about chess, and I hope you can use some of these ideas in your own games. Thank you very much for watching.